Mark Reynolds had never set foot in a restaurant like this before. The opulence surrounding him felt alien, like he was an intruder in a world designed for people far more important than himself. His fingers tapped nervously on the edge of the table as he scanned the menu. The words seemed to blur, his mind spinning. The menu was more like a work of art than a list of food choices. He could barely pronounce half of the dishes. The prices were enough to make his stomach turn. He glanced around, noticing the other patrons dressed in immaculate suits, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft hum of low conversation. He felt out of place, an ordinary man in a world where wealth, power, and influence ruled. The waiters moved silently between tables, their eyes sharp and attentive. But no one seemed to notice him, not yet. And when they did, he knew it wouldn't be a kind glance. Mark had read about this restaurant, the kind of place where only the elite could afford a meal. And today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he decided to see it for himself. Disguised, of course. He wasn't here to be recognized. Not today. But as he looked around, the reality of it all hit him. This was a world built on more than just expensive tastes. It was built on assumptions, biases, and unspoken rules. He'd seen enough of the world to know that money couldn't buy you everything. But here, in this high-end restaurant, it certainly seemed like it could. The server, a young man with a cold, calculating smile, approached his table. His eyes briefly scanned Mark, sizing him up before he spoke. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to start with a drink, or perhaps some appetizers?" The server's tone was polite, but there was something off in the way he addressed Mark, like he was waiting for a mistake. Mark could feel the judgment hanging in the air, but he wasn't sure why. "Just water for now, thank you," Mark said, his voice calm but his heart racing. The server raised an eyebrow and nodded, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "You're sure about that, sir? We have a selection of wines you might like." "I'm fine with water." Mark's voice was firmer this time, a hint of irritation creeping in. The server, still smiling politely, turned to walk away, but not before muttering something just low enough for Mark to hear. "Water, right? Looks like someone isn't quite sure if he can afford the full menu." Mark froze, the words cutting deeper than he expected. His mind raced, trying to understand why someone would treat him like this. But before he could dwell on it, the server was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the discomfort of being seen as less than he was. Was it because of his clothes? His appearance? Was he being judged for something he couldn't control? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. What Mark didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a night that would change everything. He was no ordinary man. He was Elon Musk, disguised under the name Mark Reynolds. And what no one knew yet was that this ordinary-looking man had the power to change the very fabric of society. But first, he had to experience the world that so many others lived in. As he sipped his water, Mark wondered just how long he could play along before his true identity was revealed. But for now, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider in a world that should have welcomed him. A world where wealth meant nothing, and yet, it meant everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The tension was thick in the air, and Mark was just beginning to realize how much this experience would change him. Elon Musk had never been one to live by conventional rules. From a young age, he had always felt like an outsider, even in the world of wealth he was born into. His childhood had been far from easy. Growing up in Pretoria, South Africa, with a father who was distant and a mother who worked tirelessly to support the family, Elon's early years shaped the man he would become. He had inherited his father's ambition, but also a sense of rebellion against the expectations that came with wealth. As a teenager, he spent much of his time in libraries, devouring books on science, technology, and engineering. He wasn't interested in the usual pursuits of the rich kids at his school: fast cars, expensive clothes, and lavish vacations. Instead, he was focused on bigger ideas: the future of space travel, renewable energy, and, above all, changing the world. But even with his brilliant mind, Elon never quite fit into the traditional world of the wealthy. He had been lucky to attend some of the best schools, and eventually, he made his way to Silicon Valley, where he built his empire. But as he became more successful, Elon felt more alienated from the life he had once imagined he would lead. He no longer connected with the people in his social circles, who spoke of nothing but profits, stocks, and luxury. The deeper he dove into his work, the more disconnected he became from the world around him. It wasn't until he began his routine of disguises that he truly understood the gap between himself and the people who looked up to him. It had started innocently enough. He wanted to know what it was like to be a regular person. So, he donned a variety of disguises and ventured into public spaces, blending in with the crowd. He would spend time in coffee shops, ride public transportation, and, like today, visit high-end restaurants under a different name. He wasn't doing it to play a game. He was doing it to see the world through different eyes. Today, he was Mark Reynolds, a man with a modest background, a guy who had worked his way up in life but still didn't quite fit into the world of the ultra-rich. He wore a simple black jacket, jeans, and sneakers, no designer labels to be found. His hair was a bit messier than usual, and he had purposefully avoided his usual confident posture. He wanted to see how people treated someone who didn't carry the aura of success with them. How did the world treat people who were like the Mark Reynolds of the world? Those who were struggling to survive, to find a foothold in a society that always seemed to demand more. As the waiter's rude comment echoed in his mind, Mark realized how deeply he had underestimated the social barriers that defined people's worth. In the past, he had always believed that money would be the ultimate solution to any problem, that wealth was the key to everything. He had always been aware of the inequality in the world, but now, sitting in this restaurant, experiencing it firsthand, he understood it in a way he never had before. Elon had become a billionaire by thinking differently, by taking risks, and by believing that the impossible was within reach. But today, as Mark Reynolds, he had learned a painful lesson. There were parts of society that even he couldn't bypass with all the money in the world. But what really struck him was the inherent hypocrisy in the way people viewed wealth. It wasn't enough to just have money. To be truly accepted, to be deemed worthy, you had to belong. You had to fit into the mold, something that, no matter how rich you were, was often unattainable. Money could buy access to the finest things, but it couldn't buy acceptance in a world where the rules of status were made long before you ever entered the game. Mark's experience at the restaurant was only the beginning. The sting of the server's dismissive attitude lingered in his mind as he sipped his water, contemplating what he would do next. He wasn't just going to walk away. He was in a unique position to challenge the very foundations of this social hierarchy. He could change the way people thought about wealth and class, if only they would listen. But for now, he was Mark Reynolds, a man out of place, struggling to understand the very system that had created the world he lived in. And as he sat there, alone in the luxury restaurant, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world around him, a weight that even his billions couldn't seem to lift. His thoughts were interrupted when the server returned, this time with a different attitude, though still carrying the air of superiority. "Sir, your main course is ready," the waiter said, his tone slightly warmer, though still distant. "I hope this meal is to your liking." Mark glanced up, meeting the server's eyes. "I'm sure it will be," he said quietly, forcing a smile. He couldn't shake the feeling that this whole experience was nothing more than a facade, an illusion of exclusivity that held no real meaning. As the waiter set down the dish in front of him, Mark's thoughts drifted back to the comment the server had made earlier. Was this what it felt like to be looked down upon by those who thought themselves superior? The sense of helplessness, of being invisible unless you conform to their expectations? It wasn't a feeling he was used to. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was the very lesson he needed to understand the world on a deeper level. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Mark barely tasted the food. His mind was elsewhere, calculating what his next steps should be. He had a rare opportunity to not just witness the world of wealth and privilege from the outside, but to truly experience it, to walk in the shoes of the very people who felt the sting of exclusion every day. And Mark, no, Elon, wasn't about to waste it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world, for better or worse, was about to change. And Mark Reynolds, disguised as just another face in the crowd, was going to be the catalyst. The night seemed to drag on longer than Mark had anticipated. As the seconds ticked by, he sat quietly at the table, pretending to enjoy the gourmet meal before him, though his appetite had long since vanished. His thoughts were consumed by the waiter's earlier remark. Someone isn't quite sure if he can afford the full menu. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged by appearances, but it was the first time it stung like this. Mark had been in the business world long enough to know that perception often outweighed reality. In boardrooms, among his peers, people treated him with reverence. His name opened doors, his achievements spoke for themselves. But here, in this upscale restaurant, money didn't seem to be enough. Status wasn't enough. The people around him didn't care what he had achieved. They cared about who he appeared to be. As he glanced around, Mark caught the eyes of a woman sitting at a nearby table. She had an air of superiority, her nose slightly tilted upward as she watched him from behind her glass of wine. Her gaze lingered just a little too long. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, her condescending look or the way the other patrons were obliviously whispering behind their menus, their voices hushed yet sharp enough for him to catch fragments of their conversation. I swear, these types don't know when they're out of their league. I'm pretty sure he can't even pronounce half the dishes. Do you think he's trying to impress us by ordering the cheapest thing on the menu? Mark's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was the isolation that stung the most or the recognition of something deeper, something he hadn't experienced before, the feeling of being an outsider, the thing he had been pretending to be, but now it was raw and real. And it was a hell of a lot harder to ignore than he thought it would be. He wanted to stand up and shout, to tell them who he really was, to show them that they had no idea who they were talking about. But something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the desire to understand. Or maybe it was simply the humbling reminder that no one, no matter how much they had, was truly immune to being underestimated, to being reduced to a stereotype. Mark looked down at his phone, scrolling mindlessly to distract himself from the growing discomfort. But when he glanced up again, he saw a waiter making his way toward him. This one, younger and with a sharp, professional look in his eyes, seemed to move with a sense of purpose that felt like a warning. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said, his tone suddenly more formal, almost overly polite. "Would you like to order something more substantial? Perhaps you'd like to try our signature dish?" Mark's eyebrows furrowed. Was the waiter suggesting that he wasn't capable of appreciating the finer dishes on the menu? Was he being subtly mocked again? "I'm fine, thank you," Mark replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge he hadn't intended. "I've already made my choice." The waiter hesitated, his expression faltering for just a moment. It was almost as if he was trying to decide whether to challenge Mark further. After a brief pause, he simply nodded and began to turn away. Before he could leave, Mark added, "Is there something wrong with my choice? I noticed that you didn't seem happy with it." The waiter turned back, his face reddening slightly, but he forced a smile. "Not at all, sir. I'm simply offering you an alternative. Some dishes, like our truffle lobster risotto, are quite celebrated among our more discerning clientele." More discerning clientele. Mark let the words roll around in his head. He knew what the waiter meant. This wasn't about the food. This was about proving some kind of point. The elite people in this place, who clearly had the money to buy anything they wanted, used the opportunity to assert their dominance over those they saw as beneath them. Mark couldn't help but feel the sting of his own invisibility, a feeling he wasn't used to. "I'm sure the lobster risotto is delicious," Mark said, his voice dry, "but I'm happy with my choice." The waiter stood still for a moment, his lips tight, before he turned and walked away, leaving Mark to stew in his thoughts. Mark had expected the usual high-end restaurant arrogance, subtle, passive-aggressive commentary from the staff or the occasional cold glance from the wealthy patrons. But this felt different. The judgment was more pronounced, more direct. It was clear that no one here saw him as anything more than a stranger, a man whose place in their world didn't quite fit. The question gnawed at him. Why was this the first time it felt so personal? The answers were both simple and complex. It wasn't just about the money or the image. It was about belonging. People here didn't just want money. They wanted compliance. They wanted to feel superior. They wanted to maintain an unspoken hierarchy that dictated who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. And Mark, disguised as just another ordinary man, had unknowingly crossed that line. As the meal drew to a close, Mark sat back in his chair, reflecting on how the evening had unfolded. He had gone into this experience wanting to understand the world from a different perspective, but the reality was harder than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about the difference between the wealthy and the poor. It was about the chasm between those who held power and those who didn't, and the cruelty that often accompanied the divide. He couldn't help but wonder how many people, just like him, had been treated this way. How many had been subjected to the same cold disregard? How many had endured this invisible barrier that money couldn't erase? As Mark paid the bill, he realized that the lessons learned here would stick with him long after he left. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment he stepped outside and into the cool night air, he made a silent vow. The world needed to see this. He needed to make them see it. People like him, people who didn't fit into this world of exclusivity, deserved better. And if anyone had the power to change that, it was him. Mark Reynolds, Elon Musk, had entered this restaurant as a test. But now, it was a challenge. He was ready to expose the cracks in this carefully constructed illusion. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to make them pay attention, and it wasn't going to be pretty. And Mark couldn't help but wonder, as he walked away, if he'd just begun something much bigger than he could imagine. Mark stepped out of the luxurious restaurant, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. The tension from the night still lingered in his chest, and the weight of the server's insults echoed in his mind. He had gone in looking for an experience, a glimpse into a world that had long been foreign to him. But what he found was something far darker. A system built on invisible walls of exclusion, a world that didn't just discriminate on wealth, but on who was allowed to belong. As he walked down the quiet street, his mind raced. The sting of the evening wasn't just about being treated poorly. He had been treated that way before. It was the realization that, in this world, money wasn't the answer. The exclusive circles he had spent years navigating with wealth and technology weren't just about who could pay the highest price. They were about who fit into the mold of acceptable. In that moment, Mark realized just how deep the divide ran, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. I can't let this go, he thought. This needs to change. Back in his car, Mark pulled up his phone. The feeling of being dismissed, of being reduced to a stereotype, surged through him once more. He typed quickly, his fingers flying across the screen as he began to draft a post that would reach millions. He wasn't just going to sit back and be insulted. No, he was going to expose this inequality. He was going to change the conversation around wealth, class, and the elitism that governs so much of society. With a deep breath, Mark hit send. The tweet read, "Tonight, I visited one of the most exclusive restaurants in the world. But what I found wasn't luxury, it was an unspoken hierarchy. And I was treated like I didn't belong. I'll be sharing more soon. #power of belonging #wealth is enough." He sat back in his seat, watching as the notifications flooded in. People had started to react. Some agreed with him, others mocked him. But for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of control over something. He wasn't just another billionaire hiding behind closed doors. He was a man with a mission. And that mission was bigger than himself. The next morning, his phone was flooded with responses. News outlets picked up on his tweet, and soon, the story of Mark Reynolds, the ordinary man who had been treated as inferior in a luxury restaurant, was trending everywhere. His words resonated with people, especially those who had experienced similar forms of discrimination, those who had felt the sting of being treated as less than. For many, Mark's experience wasn't just a one-off. It was a reflection of the struggles they faced every day in a society that valued status and appearances above all else. Mark knew the power of social media, but this wasn't just about gaining attention. This was about shaking the foundations of something that had been accepted for too long. As his message gained momentum, he started to receive messages from individuals and organizations that wanted to support him. Some spoke of changes they wanted to see in how businesses treated their customers, while others shared their own stories of exclusion and mistreatment. The more he read, the more he realized how deep the problem ran, and how many people were desperate for a solution. And as the response continued to grow, so did the pressure. The media started to circle around him, eager to get an interview, to hear his story in full. But Mark knew this wasn't about him. It was about the larger message. The exclusive, elitist systems that many of the rich and powerful hid behind were hurting people in ways they often didn't see, or worse, didn't care about. After a few days of carefully crafting his next steps, Mark decided to act. He was going to host a summit, a public gathering that would bring together the voices of those who had been pushed aside by the elitist systems of society. This was no longer just a critique of a single restaurant, but an opportunity to spark a larger conversation about privilege, class, and the false assumptions that govern society. He reached out to activists, influencers, and thought leaders who shared his vision. They were quick to join the cause, eager to stand alongside him in the fight for belonging and equality. What started as a small, personal outrage had grown into something much bigger, something that could have real consequences. The day of the summit arrived. The venue was packed with people from all walks of life. Employees who had been overlooked by powerful bosses, entrepreneurs who had struggled to get their businesses off the ground, and activists who had spent years fighting for a more inclusive world. It was a melting pot of voices, each sharing their stories of struggle and hope. Mark stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. He had come a long way from that cold, isolated restaurant. The disdain he had felt that night now felt like fuel for something far greater. His words, once aimed at exposing an unjust system, were now directed at inspiring change. "We're here today not just to talk about exclusion," Mark began, his voice steady and clear. "We're here to change the way people see the world, to change the way society defines who belongs and who doesn't. The truth is, no one is truly out of their league. We all belong. And it's time for us to create a world where no one has to hide behind a mask or play a role to be accepted. Where wealth isn't the measure of a person's worth, but the actions they take to make the world better." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Mark felt like he was no longer a man out of place. He was a man with a purpose. The journey he had begun as a test, as an experiment in understanding elitism, had turned into something bigger, a movement for change. As the event wrapped up, Mark received a message from an unexpected source, the restaurant. They had reached out for a private meeting. They wanted to address the situation and discuss how they could make amends. Mark smiled to himself. It was the first sign that things were beginning to shift. But this wasn't just about one restaurant. It was about society, about redefining the rules of belonging and changing the narrative for good. And Mark, disguised as an ordinary man, had just become the catalyst for a movement that was about to sweep through the world. The journey had just begun, and Mark knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. But he was ready. He had found his purpose, and nothing would stop him now. Mark's summit had been a success, the first step in what was quickly becoming a movement that was gaining traction across social media and mainstream news. But with success came consequences. As the media frenzy grew, so did the scrutiny. Not everyone shared Mark's vision. Many of the wealthier circles, the same ones he had once belonged to, were starting to turn against him. The backlash was swift and brutal. "What does Elon Musk really know about the struggles of the average person?" one commentator on a major news outlet sneered. "This billionaire, hiding behind a disguise, pretends to understand what it's like to be excluded from society. He's lived his life surrounded by luxury, wealth, and privilege. He is the problem, not the solution." The accusations ranged from mocking to outright hostile. Many saw Mark's campaign as a publicity stunt, an attempt to downplay the very systems of power that had made him rich. Some questioned his motives, suggesting that he was merely using the poor as pawns in a game to reclaim some misplaced moral high ground. "He's just trying to play the role of the hero now," another pundit remarked. But what do you do when the hero is also the villain? The barrage of insults weighed heavily on Mark, but he knew he had to push through. For all the support he had garnered, there was an equal amount of venom directed at him. Yet, what struck him most wasn't the scorn of the rich. It was the disappointment of the people who had believed in him. They had placed their hopes in his ability to effect change, and now they were questioning whether he had the strength to face this battle. One morning, after an especially brutal series of tweets from critics, Mark found himself standing at the window of his office, staring out over the city. The weight of his mission seemed so much heavier now. The once exciting vision of change had become muddled by the ugliness of the attacks against him. Could he really change anything? Could a man who had spent so many years in a world of extreme wealth and privilege ever truly be a voice for the oppressed? The doubts crept in, and with them, a sense of isolation. Despite the millions who supported him, despite the countless messages of encouragement, Mark felt more alone than ever. It wasn't just the rich elites who were attacking him. It was also the very people he sought to help. The working-class individuals, the ones he had hoped would stand alongside him in this fight, were growing skeptical. They questioned whether his intentions were pure or whether he was just using their struggles as another marketing tool. "Who is this man really?" one message read. "He can't just throw on a disguise and pretend he knows what it's like to be one of us. He's just another billionaire with a savior complex." Mark's stomach twisted as he read those words. How had it all gone so wrong? He had never intended to deceive anyone. His mission had always been to shine a light on the inequalities that he had witnessed firsthand. But now, it seemed like his own privilege was the very thing holding him back from connecting with the people who needed his message the most. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. This wasn't just a fight against the elite. It was a fight against his own image. For all the good intentions in the world, Mark realized that no amount of fame, money, or even disguise could change how the world saw him. To many, he would always be the billionaire who had it all. To some, he was no better than the people who had treated him so poorly at the restaurant. But there was one voice that cut through the noise. It came from a woman who had reached out to him on social media. Her message was simple but powerful. "I've been following your journey, Mark, and I just wanted to say that I see what you're trying to do. I'm one of the people you're fighting for. And even though I don't have millions of followers, I want you to know that your actions are changing things for people like me. Don't let the noise get to you. Keep going." It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite the spark that had been dimming inside of him. The doubt that had taken root in his heart slowly began to fade as he reread her message. She was right. He was making a difference, whether the world saw it or not. The people who needed his voice most would always be the ones who mattered, and they weren't going to be drowned out by the loud voices of his critics. The following days were a whirlwind. Mark used the backlash as fuel. Instead of retreating, he dove deeper into the cause. He spoke out more, pushing the conversation about privilege, classism, and elitism further into the public sphere. He worked with influencers and activists to help elevate the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. He even reached out to the very restaurant that had sparked it all, demanding they change their practices and acknowledge the harm they had done. But there was one thing that stood out to him. As much as he fought against the system, he still hadn't fully reckoned with the truth about himself. Could he truly ever escape the labels that had been placed on him? One evening, after a particularly emotional interview, Mark found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him was not the man he had hoped to become. He had spent so much time focusing on the external fight, on changing the systems that held people back, that he had neglected the internal battle, the one that would determine whether he could truly transform himself from the billionaire outsider to a true ally. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt the weight of his own humanity, the mistakes, the privilege, and the years of being blind to the struggles of others. This wasn't just about changing society. It was about changing himself. With a deep breath, he made a decision. "I will not quit. I will make this right." Mark took to social media again, addressing his followers. "I know that I've made mistakes. I've been blind to the struggles of many people, and I understand that my actions have hurt some of you. I want to be part of the solution, but I also know that means I have to listen, to learn, and to change. I won't stop fighting for the people who need it most, and I will do it better. I promise you that." The response was overwhelming, but it was different this time. People appreciated his honesty, his willingness to confront the truth. There were still those who doubted him, but Mark understood now that the journey wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. And as long as he kept moving forward, no matter how difficult the road, he would find the way. The emotional roller coaster wasn't over, but Mark was more determined than ever to see this through. The fight for belonging was far from finished. But now, he was ready to face it, head on. The backlash had been overwhelming, but it had also given Mark a clarity he hadn't expected. He had been so focused on proving something to the world that he had failed to realize the most important lesson. True change started within. As the weeks passed, he began to shift his approach, not just in his activism, but in his approach to personal growth. Mark's social media post apologizing for his earlier missteps had sparked a wave of conversations. Some were still skeptical, but many more had respected his honesty. Slowly, he started to see a shift in his perception, not only from his followers, but also from those who had initially criticized him. People began to recognize that the journey he was on was not one of a billionaire playing at activism, but rather a man who had been given a platform and was finally waking up to his own privilege. Mark knew it wasn't going to be a quick fix. Transforming the way society viewed privilege and belonging would take time. But he was no longer just pushing forward for the sake of his message. He was learning to live the message. The conversations shifted. Instead of being a lone crusader, Mark started to elevate the voices of others. He listened to stories, he acknowledged mistakes, and he used his influence to amplify those who had been ignored for too long. One morning, while sipping coffee in his office, Mark received an unexpected call. It was from the restaurant that had started it all, the one where he had been humiliated and forced to confront his own vulnerability. To his surprise, the manager was on the other end of the line, offering a genuine apology. "Mr. Reynolds," the manager said, his voice carefully measured but sincere, "we've been watching the conversations you've sparked. We want to do better, and we're asking for your guidance. We recognize the harm we've done, and we'd like to make amends." Mark paused, unsure of what to say. After everything that had happened, he hadn't expected this level of accountability from a place like that. He had anticipated defensive reactions, or worse, complete silence. But here was an establishment willing to confront its role in perpetuating a system of exclusion. "This isn't just about you," Mark said, his voice more calm than he felt. "This is about all of us. All of us who have been complicit in systems that divide and exclude. If you're serious about making change, it has to go beyond a single apology. It needs to be a cultural shift, one that begins with the way you treat every person who walks through your door." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the manager replied, "We're committed to making that shift. Would you be willing to help us create a program that fosters inclusivity, not just for your customers, but for our staff, too?" It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the grand revolution he had initially imagined, but it was a start. Mark agreed to help the restaurant design a new set of policies and training programs that would focus on inclusivity, empathy, and treating people with respect, no matter their background or appearance. It was small, but it was meaningful. Soon after, Mark used his platform to share the news, making it clear that real progress required effort and self-reflection, even from the wealthiest corners of society. This gesture from the restaurant, combined with his own shift in focus, began to slowly change the way people viewed him, not just as a billionaire trying to make amends, but as someone who was actively engaging with the very system that had once granted him such unchecked privilege. For the first time in months, Mark felt a sense of peace. The tension that had gripped him after the restaurant incident was finally easing. He was no longer simply reacting to the world's judgment. He was shaping it. He was becoming part of something larger than himself, a movement that encouraged people to examine their own biases, their own role in perpetuating systems of exclusion, and their potential to make a difference. One evening, as Mark sat in his study reflecting on how far he had come, he received a call from a journalist he respected. The journalist had been following the events closely, and now, after months of intense scrutiny, he wanted to interview Mark for an in-depth article on the progress he had made. "I've got to say, Mark," the journalist said, "when this story first broke, we all thought you were just another wealthy man trying to atone for his sins. But now it's different. You've sparked something real. People are listening." Mark smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The fight wasn't over, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges, but he could finally see the impact of his work. He had always been a man who thrived on challenges, on solving the impossible. And now this was his greatest challenge yet. Not to create the most successful company or build the next big thing, but to create a more inclusive world for everyone, no matter their background or financial status. "What do you think your legacy will be, Mark?" the journalist asked. Mark thought for a moment, his mind drifting back to the person he had been when he first entered that restaurant, the man who had walked in wearing the mask of an ordinary customer, but who had been forced to confront a deeper, more universal truth. I think, Mark began slowly, my legacy will be about more than just technology or business. I want to be remembered as someone who saw the cracks in the system and tried to heal them, not just by talking about it, but by actually listening and doing something about it. The journalist chuckled, clearly impressed. I think that's exactly the kind of legacy people need right now. As Mark ended the call, he sat back in his chair, letting the quiet of the evening settle around him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to chase the next big thing or make another grand gesture. He was content with the path he was on, a path of humility, accountability, and meaningful change. The journey that had started in the confines of a luxury restaurant had become something far greater than he had ever imagined. It was no longer just about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to himself. And for the first time in a long while, Mark knew that he was on the right path. The world was changing, and Mark Reynolds, once just an ordinary man in disguise, was becoming part of the change. His story wasn't over. It had only just begun. As Mark settled into his newfound role as an advocate for inclusivity and social change, he was beginning to see the ripple effects of his actions. What had started as a personal mission to expose elitism and classism in one restaurant had now evolved into a much larger movement, one that challenged societal norms in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd spoken at universities, collaborated with organizations dedicated to social justice, and used his platform to support causes he had once ignored or overlooked. But despite the growing support, the road ahead was far from smooth. The more Mark pushed for change, the more resistance he encountered. Some were still skeptical of his motivations. There were those who believed he was simply trying to absolve himself of guilt for a lifetime of privilege, while others felt that his efforts, no matter how well-intentioned, were too little, too late. But Mark didn't let it dishearten him. He knew that real change would take time, and not everyone would be on board right away. What mattered was that he was committed, and he was willing to keep showing up. One of the most powerful moments in his journey came when he was invited to a panel discussion about class, privilege, and the future of social equity. The room was packed with influential thought leaders, activists, and academics, people who had been fighting for change long before Mark had even considered using his voice. As he walked onto the stage, the weight of his words felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about a restaurant anymore. It was about the very fabric of society. As the discussion unfolded, Mark listened intently to the other panelists, each offering insights into the ways that power, race, and wealth intersected in deeply entrenched systems. But when it was his turn to speak, he found himself pausing. The words he had rehearsed in his head no longer seemed adequate. "I've spent my life building empires," Mark began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've built things that have changed the world in many ways, but I've also built walls. I've been part of a system that has ignored, excluded, and silenced people who don't have the resources to fight back. And I've only recently begun to understand the true cost of that." The room fell silent. There was no applause, no immediate response. But Mark could feel the shift in the energy around him. It wasn't just the words he was saying. It was the honesty, the vulnerability, and the recognition of his own complicity that resonated. "For too long," Mark continued, "I've been focused on the idea that wealth is the solution. But wealth is not the answer. It can't be. It only creates more division. It's time for all of us to redefine what it means to belong. It's not about how much money you have. It's about how we treat each other, how we create space for everyone at the table." The applause came slowly at first, but soon it was overwhelming. Mark wasn't just a rich man trying to make amends. He was a man who had genuinely understood the problem, accepted his part in it, and was now working towards a solution. The conversation that followed his speech was one of the most profound he had ever been a part of. In the weeks that followed, Mark received countless messages of support from unexpected places. He heard from former colleagues who had once been skeptical of his efforts, from activists who were cautiously optimistic, and from everyday people who shared their stories of exclusion, discrimination, and the barriers they had faced because of their class, race, or background. These messages were powerful, but one stood out above the rest. It came from the same woman who had reached out to him months earlier, the one who had encouraged him to keep going despite the overwhelming criticism. This time, her message was longer, more personal. "Mark, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the people who was skeptical of you in the beginning. I was afraid you were just another rich guy trying to look like he cares. But I've been following your journey, and I've seen the difference you're making. You've made me believe that change is possible, even for someone like me. I wanted to thank you for not giving up on us." Mark sat back in his chair, reading the message over and over. He had never considered himself someone capable of sparking real change, not at this level. Yet here was a woman whose perspective had shifted, whose life had been impacted by the very actions he had taken. It was moments like this, small, personal moments, that reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. He thought back to the original goal that had set everything into motion, to expose the exclusivity and elitism that had defined his world for so long. But now, that goal felt incomplete. The movement had grown beyond the restaurant, beyond even his own personal experiences. It had become a call to action for a society that needed to reimagine its values. It was no longer about one individual standing up for what was right. It was about creating a collective effort to break down barriers and build a more inclusive future. Mark knew that he couldn't do it alone. The movement was no longer his. It belonged to the people who had suffered in silence, the ones who had been overlooked, and the ones who had been told they didn't matter. They were the ones who had the power to shape the future, and he was determined to use his resources to support them. To that end, Mark began working on an initiative that would fund organizations and projects focused on economic empowerment, social justice, and education. He wanted to create a legacy that would outlast his own personal journey, a legacy that would continue to impact communities long after he was gone. But before all that, there was one more step to take. Mark returned to the restaurant, the one that had sparked this entire transformation. The managers and staff had gone through their own set of training programs, focused on inclusivity, empathy, and respect for all people, no matter their background. The changes were small, but they were significant. The restaurant had shifted from a symbol of elitism to a space that truly valued everyone who walked through its doors. Mark stood outside the restaurant, looking up at the gleaming facade. He wasn't the same man who had first entered those doors, angry and disillusioned. He had become something more, a man who had learned the power of reflection, of accountability, and of embracing vulnerability in the face of discomfort. As he walked inside, he smiled at the familiar faces, knowing that this moment, this journey, was only the beginning. The world was changing, and he would continue to fight for a future where everyone had a place at the table. The journey had taken Mark to unexpected places, places he never imagined, both within himself and in the world around him. But he was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in the fight for change, and he would continue that fight, no matter what it took. Mark's transformation from a wealthy businessman to a social advocate had taken him further than he ever thought possible. But even as he gained momentum, he couldn't shake the feeling that he still had much to learn. The weight of responsibility continued to grow, and with it, the realization that his journey was far from over. He was facing the challenges of not only changing his own life but helping others to see the world through a different lens, a lens that valued people over power. One evening, after a long day of meetings and talks about his new initiative, Mark received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, but there was something about it that made Mark stop. "Mr. Reynolds, I've been following your work for some time now. I believe you're at a crossroads. You're on the verge of something significant, but you need guidance." Mark was silent for a moment, unsure of who was calling or what they wanted. The voice continued. "My name is Nina Harris. I've spent my life working in social justice, and I believe there's more for you to do. But you need to stop thinking about the world in terms of what you can fix and start thinking about it in terms of what you can build. That's the real work." Mark's interest peaked. Nina's words struck him with an unexpected force, and he felt a strange, compelling pull to learn more. "Tell me more," he asked, his curiosity growing. Over the next few weeks, Nina and Mark began a series of conversations, both over the phone and in person. Nina had worked for years in grassroots organizations, focused on systemic change in communities that had been left behind. Her work was unapologetically focused on the very people Mark had once overlooked. Yet, despite their different backgrounds, Nina's insights resonated with him deeply. She didn't mince words when it came to his previous attempts at change. She told him bluntly that while he was doing good work, it wasn't enough to simply speak out or fund initiatives. True change, she explained, required dismantling the very systems of power that he had once been a part of. "You can't just donate your way to equity, Mark," she said one evening over coffee. "And you can't simply create a project and walk away, thinking the job's done. You've got to be prepared to get your hands dirty. You've got to live the change. It's not just about awareness, it's about transformation. And that starts with understanding the difference between charity and justice." Mark listened, humbled by her directness and knowledge. He had thought that using his wealth to create new projects would be enough. He had been operating in the same framework that had served him well in business, a framework of building, fixing, and innovating. But Nina was showing him that the work needed to be deeper, more rooted in the community, more connected to the very people he wanted to uplift. She challenged him to immerse himself in these communities, to listen with intent, to understand their struggles without coming in with predetermined solutions. Mark had grown accustomed to being the one who solved problems, the one who had answers. But what Nina was offering him was something much more profound, a way to deconstruct his own worldview, a way to lead with humility rather than with a sense of saviorism. One of the most difficult lessons Nina taught Mark was that true social justice didn't come from a place of heroism. It came from collaboration, from being willing to step back and allow others to lead. The power, she told him, was already within the communities he wanted to help. The role of someone like Mark was not to lead the charge, but to amplify the voices of those who had been unheard for far too long. Mark had his doubts at first. It was hard to imagine giving up control over the projects he had worked so hard to build. But as he spent more time with Nina and began to connect with local leaders and community activists, he began to see things differently. He realized that real power lay not in owning the narrative, but in sharing it. Together, Mark and Nina worked on a new initiative, one that was not about fixing problems from the outside, but about empowering communities to take ownership of their own futures. This new approach would involve community-led projects where the people most affected by systemic inequalities would be the ones driving the change, with Mark's resources and influence serving as support rather than as the driving force. Mark was beginning to see the difference. This wasn't about creating one-off projects or checking boxes for social good. This was about ensuring that communities had the tools, resources, and agency to determine their own paths forward. But this approach wasn't without its challenges. As they began implementing Nina's vision, Mark faced resistance from some of his closest allies. Many of the board members from his previous initiatives didn't understand why he was stepping back. They questioned why he was giving so much power to the very people who had been disenfranchised for so long. Some feared that by relinquishing control, Mark might lose the influence that had allowed him to make such a significant impact. But Mark was resolute. He wasn't afraid of losing influence. What mattered now was ensuring that the people who had been silenced for generations were given the platform to speak for themselves. As the months passed, the initiative gained traction. Communities began to take ownership of their own futures, designing projects that were tailored to their specific needs. People were learning how to advocate for themselves, build their own businesses, and create sustainable change from the ground up. The results were not instantaneous, but they were real. And that, Mark realized, was the most important thing. There was no single moment of triumph, no grand victory speech. The work was ongoing, the battles constant, but every small step, every community that found its voice, every person who reclaimed their power, was a victory in its own right. One day, as Mark walked through one of the communities they had been working with, he ran into an old friend, a fellow businessman who had once been part of the elite circles he had moved in. "You really are doing this, huh?" his friend said, looking at him with a mix of awe and skepticism. "I thought it was just a phase. But this is real." Mark smiled, his response simple but meaningful. "Yeah, it's real. It has to be." And as he walked away, he realized just how far he had come. The journey had taken him from a luxury restaurant to the heart of communities that had been left behind for far too long. Along the way, he had learned that true leadership wasn't about being at the front. It was about empowering others to lead, about creating space for those who had been overlooked and silenced. His work wasn't finished, but it was evolving, and that was enough for now. Mark had come full circle, no longer the man he once was, but someone far more powerful. And the work, the real work, was only just beginning. Mark had always considered himself a man of action. His success in business came from making quick decisions, solving problems efficiently, and always looking for ways to grow. But as his work in social justice deepened, he realized that growth in this context didn't follow the same fast-paced rules he was used to. It was slow, deliberate, and often messy. Despite his commitment, things were starting to feel harder than ever. The more Mark pushed for structural change, the more he found himself facing resistance, not just from the outside, but from within his own initiatives. The communities he was trying to help were making incredible strides, but they were also running into the deep-seated challenges that had existed for decades. These issues couldn't be solved in one meeting or with a single donation. They required years, perhaps generations, of sustained effort. One of the most difficult moments came when one of the community projects Mark had been closely involved with hit a wall. It was a housing initiative aimed at creating affordable housing in an area that had been severely gentrified. The plan had been well received at first. It seemed like the perfect solution to combat rising rents and the displacement of longtime residents. But when it came time to implement, the project faced major opposition from the city's wealthier residents and developers. Despite Mark's involvement and his public push for the initiative, the opposition was strong. The developers had deep connections in City Hall and were able to rally enough support to delay the project. Public hearings were filled with angry residents who argued that the new housing would ruin the neighborhood's character. The pushback was both deeply frustrating and, for Mark, personally hurtful. He had spent so much time and energy on this initiative, but the progress felt slow and often like it was unraveling. Mark found himself grappling with feelings of helplessness. He had spent years in the business world, solving problems and seeing immediate results. This was different. This wasn't a problem he could solve with money or quick fixes. This was about undoing decades of inequality, and the pace of progress was far slower than he had anticipated. "What's the point?" he said one evening, voicing his frustration to Nina. "I've thrown every resource at this project, and it still feels like we're running in circles. I'm not used to losing, Nina." Nina, who had been by his side through many of these struggles, didn't offer comfort or easy answers. Instead, she reminded him that true progress often feels like a struggle. "You're not losing," she said, her voice firm. "You're up against a system that was never meant to work for people like you, or for people like them. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but this is how change happens. It's not about winning every battle. It's about staying in the fight." Mark had heard those words before, but for the first time, they hit him with a new weight. He realized that this fight wasn't just about him making an impact or being a hero. It was about standing firm, even when it felt like the world was working against you. It was about creating a foundation of change that would outlast his own involvement, even if it meant taking a few steps backward before moving forward. But just as he was starting to gather himself, another unexpected challenge arose. A group of his former business partners had reached out, urging him to come back into the world of corporate business. They had seen his efforts in social justice and were impressed. They wanted him to lead a new, profitable initiative that combined his passion for change with the resources and power of the corporate world. At first, the offer seemed tempting. The idea of being able to combine his business expertise with his newfound commitment to social equity seemed like the perfect marriage of his two worlds. But as the days passed, the offer became increasingly difficult to ignore. He was tempted by the opportunity to return to the familiar world of high stakes and big rewards. Nina could see the conflict written all over Mark's face. She knew how hard it was to resist the pull of his old life, the world that had once given him everything he thought he wanted. But she also knew that the world he was stepping into now was different. It was more complex, more uncertain, and the stakes were much higher than they had been in business. "You have a choice to make," Nina said one afternoon. "You can go back to what you know. You can build something big, fast, and powerful. Or you can stay in this fight. But if you go back, don't fool yourself into thinking it will be the same. You'll have the resources, but you'll also have the responsibility. And it won't be easy. It will be a different kind of struggle. Mark sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The easy path, the path that promised instant success and gratification, called to him. But the harder path, the one he had been walking with Nina, the one that had challenged everything he thought he knew about success, was the one that felt right. The truth was, Mark was terrified. He had spent so much of his life building something from nothing. Returning to the business world meant leaving behind the uncertainty and risk of social justice work. It meant returning to a world where the value of success was measured in profits and power, not in people or change. But something deep inside him told him that he couldn't go back. He had made a commitment to the work he was doing now, to the people who were counting on him. His journey wasn't just about feeling good about his actions. It was about making real, lasting change. And if that meant enduring more setbacks, more opposition, and more personal struggles, then that's what he would have to do. "You're right," Mark said finally, his voice steady. "I can't go back. I have to stay in this fight. It's not about winning the game. It's about changing the rules." Nina smiled, her pride in him evident. "That's the right decision. It's going to be tough, Mark, but you're not alone. We're all in this together." Mark's resolve solidified as he made a decision that would define the next chapter of his journey. He wasn't going back to his old life. The fight for a more equitable world was just beginning. He had seen firsthand how deep the roots of inequality went, and he was committed to pulling them out, no matter how long it took. As he prepared for the next steps, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and tough decisions. But he was no longer the man who sought quick fixes or easy wins. Mark had discovered that the real battle wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about changing the way people thought, changing systems, and changing the very fabric of society itself. And he was ready for the fight. Mark's journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to embrace the uncertainty, knowing that it would lead to something far greater than he had ever imagined. The days after Mark's decision to stay committed to his social justice work were a blur of activity. New initiatives were launched, partnerships were forged, and the momentum felt like it might finally be building into something tangible. But despite his outward sense of purpose, Mark was beginning to feel the weight of it all. The constant pressure to make a difference was exhausting. The roadblocks kept coming, new political challenges, bureaucratic red tape, and backlash from people who weren't ready for the change he was advocating. Each success seemed to come with an equal measure of failure, and the fight for equity felt like it was always 2 steps ahead, just out of reach. Then came the moment that Mark hadn't expected. He was hosting a community meeting for a new initiative in a disadvantaged neighborhood, hoping to connect local leaders with resources to help revitalize the area. The meeting room was crowded with passionate residents, but something in the air felt off. The tension was palpable. As Mark spoke about the potential of the project, he noticed a woman sitting in the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly. She had an intense, watchful gaze that made him feel exposed. When the floor opened for questions, she stood up, her voice cutting through the air. "I've heard it all before, Mark," she said, her tone filled with skepticism. "You've come here with your money, your fancy speeches, and your promises. But we've been promised change so many times, and nothing's ever happened. You're just another person who thinks they can save us. And I'm tired of being told what we need." The room fell silent. Mark felt the weight of her words hit him harder than anything else had. The anger, the disappointment, the years of broken promises, it was all in her voice. And for a moment, he felt like he was back at square one, standing in front of a woman who had every right to be angry, but no faith in him or the system he represented. He had no words in that moment. The fear of being rejected, of having his efforts dismissed as just another failed attempt, gripped him. He had never felt more vulnerable. He had made so many mistakes along the way, and now he was facing the consequences. Was he really part of the solution, or just another person reinforcing the same cycle? "I understand why you feel that way," Mark said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I can't pretend to know what you've gone through or the pain you've experienced. But I can promise you this. I'm not here to save anyone. I'm here to stand beside you, to support you. This work isn't about me. It's about you. And I'll do whatever I can to make sure your voices are heard." The woman didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a quiet stillness that settled over Mark like a weight he couldn't shake. The meeting continued, but his mind kept replaying her words. He had tried to do the right thing, but in that moment, he had failed to bridge the gap between his intentions and the reality of what these communities had endured. Later that night, Mark sat in his office, staring blankly at the piles of documents in front of him. He felt like he had let down everyone he had set out to help. He couldn't sleep. The voices of the people he had failed to reach echoed in his mind. And for the first time in his life, he doubted everything. Nina had been trying to reach him for hours, but Mark didn't pick up. She knew something was wrong, and when she finally found him sitting in the dark, his face drawn and exhausted, she didn't need to ask. "You're at the breaking point, aren't you?" Nina said softly, sitting down beside him. "You've been pushing so hard, you've forgotten to breathe." Mark didn't respond at first. He didn't know what to say. He had put so much of himself into this work, but it was never enough. It felt like no matter how much he gave, it would never be enough to erase the years of injustice that had come before him. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was making a difference, but all I'm doing is making promises I can't keep. I don't know if I can change anything. I don't know if I'm even the right person for this." Nina sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. She understood the exhaustion that came with this work, the emotional toll of constantly pushing against systems that didn't want to change, the constant questioning of one's motives and impact. "Mark," she said finally, her voice firm but kind, "this work isn't about you. It's never been about you. It's about the people who've been silenced for far too long. It's about their voices, their struggles, and their futures. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never be able to fix everything. You're human, but you are making a difference. And you're not alone in this. The people you're working with, they want to see you succeed, and they need you to keep going." Mark looked at her, the weight of his own failure lifting just slightly with her words. "But what if I fail them? What if I'm not enough?" "You already are," Nina said softly. "You're not perfect, but you're here. You're showing up. And that's more than most people ever do." Mark closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. He wasn't sure if he could keep going. The emotional toll was far greater than he had anticipated, and the pressure felt unbearable. But in that moment, he realized something important. It wasn't about never failing. It was about getting back up after each failure, learning from it, and continuing the work. "I don't know how to keep going," Mark admitted, "but I know I can't stop now." Nina smiled. "That's the first step. The rest will follow. But remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You don't have to fix everything overnight." Mark sat in silence for a while, absorbing her words. The emotional roller coaster he had been on, the highs and lows of his journey, had all led to this moment. The realization that true change wasn't going to come quickly or easily. It was going to take time, effort, and a lot of failure along the way. But he had come too far to give up now. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in days, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mark had reached his breaking point, but it was also the moment he realized that the true power of his journey lay in his ability to rise after each fall. The fight for change wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days following Mark's emotional breakdown were difficult, filled with reflection, doubt, and self-questioning. His resolve had been shaken, but in the quiet moments, he knew he could not walk away. The weight of his failures felt heavy, but so did the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. It was a responsibility that wasn't his to bear alone, but that of every person he sought to uplift. Nina's words echoed in his mind. You don't have to fix everything overnight. Still, Mark felt a sense of urgency he couldn't shake. Time was running out. The world wasn't waiting for him to get it right. But as he looked at his progress, at the communities he had already started to help, he realized that change was always going to be a slow, winding road. He could no longer expect overnight success. The next few weeks were a series of small victories and setbacks. Some projects hit new obstacles, but others moved forward. There were moments of despair, but they were often followed by moments of hope. His work, though challenging, began to take shape in ways that felt real. And with every success, the fire in him to keep going was reignited. Then, something unexpected happened. Mark had been invited to a high-profile panel discussion about corporate social responsibility. The event was attended by influential leaders in business, philanthropy, and politics. The discussion was meant to focus on how corporate entities could better integrate social good into their operations. As the event unfolded, Mark sat quietly, listening to panelists who spoke passionately about the importance of doing good. But there was an underlying disconnect. It felt like the conversation was more about maintaining an image than actually making a meaningful difference. After the event, Mark was approached by a familiar face. Daniel Myers, an old business associate from his previous life in tech. Daniel had always been the type to excel in the corporate world, climbing the ladder effortlessly with charm and strategic thinking. He was the kind of person who saw business as a game to win, not necessarily as a tool for social change. "Mark, I've been hearing a lot about your new projects." "Social justice, huh?" Daniel said, his voice laced with both admiration and a hint of amusement. "I gotta admit, I'm impressed. But you and I both know that these things don't happen overnight. You've got to have the right tools, the right partners." Mark's instincts told him to brush off the conversation. He had no interest in slipping back into the corporate world, where profit margins and personal ambition were the main focus. But something in Daniel's tone caught his attention. There was a sense of genuine curiosity, not just for the work Mark was doing, but for the potential he saw in him. "I'm not doing this for the profit, Daniel," Mark replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "This is bigger than that. It's about changing the systems that have been in place for too long. It's about making things better for people who have been left behind." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And you think you're the one to change it all? Come on, Mark. You can't keep pretending that business isn't a part of the solution. If you want to really make an impact, you need to think bigger. You've got the resources, the connections. You could partner with companies, fund initiatives, make real change happen. But you've got to be willing to step back into that world. That's where the power is." Mark felt a flicker of frustration. "I don't want to go back, Daniel. I don't want to be just another corporate guy in a suit. I'm trying to create a different kind of power. A power that comes from collaboration, from grassroots efforts, from people who've been fighting for their own survival for years." Daniel chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "Look, Mark, I get it. I respect what you're doing. But don't fool yourself into thinking you can fix the system by working outside of it. The real change comes from within. And that's where I can help." Mark was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. He had always known that the business world operated on a different set of rules, but hearing Daniel's words made him question his own approach. Could he really make the kind of impact he wanted by working outside the corporate world? Could he achieve the same level of transformation by sticking to his grassroots methods? Before Mark could respond, Daniel handed him a business card. "Think about it. You've got the heart, Mark. You just need the right partners." As Mark left the event that evening, he found himself in a whirlwind of thoughts. He had spent so much time trying to build something from the ground up, using the tools he had. But what if Daniel was right? What if he was limiting himself by refusing to work within the system? Could he really make the change he wanted without compromising his values? The following days were filled with contemplation. Mark met with Nina to discuss his thoughts, and she immediately saw the conflict in his eyes. "You're considering it, aren't you?" she asked. Mark hesitated. "I don't know. Daniel thinks I could partner with big companies, use the resources to make a bigger impact. But I don't want to lose sight of why I started this in the first place. I don't want to become just another corporate guy." Nina leaned forward. "I get it. It's not an easy decision. But you've always been about creating a new kind of leadership, one that doesn't just focus on profits or power. You've been about people. But that doesn't mean you have to abandon the tools that could help you do more. There's no shame in using what you've learned in business to make real change. Just don't lose yourself in the process." Mark thought long and hard about Nina's words. He had always believed that success didn't have to come at the expense of others, but he had spent so much time resisting the corporate world, afraid that he would lose sight of his values if he returned to it. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of the system as something to fight against and start thinking of it as something he could reshape from within. The challenge now was figuring out how to balance his principles with the reality of the world he was trying to change. Mark was beginning to realize that real change didn't require rejecting the system. It required transforming it. As the path ahead became clearer, Mark knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice would not be easy. But with the right people, the right tools, and the right mindset, it was a fight he was willing to continue. The question now wasn't whether he could change the system, but how he would do it, and what kind of leader he would become in the process. As the days passed, Mark's inner turmoil settled, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned something crucial in his struggles. The world wasn't black and white. There was no perfect way to create change, no one-size-fits-all solution. He didn't need to reject the tools of the corporate world, but rather, he needed to use them to challenge the systems that perpetuated inequality. It was about using the power and resources available to him, not to climb higher, but to help lift others along the way. Just as Mark was starting to adjust to this new mindset, he received a call that would change everything. It was Daniel again. "Mark, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think I can help," Daniel said, his tone now serious and urgent. "There's an opportunity one think you should consider. A partnership that could open doors for your projects. If you're serious about taking this to the next level, you need to be involved in this." Mark raised an eyebrow, sensing that this wasn't just a casual conversation. "What's the deal?" Daniel paused before speaking, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "It's a venture fund, a big one, the kind that backs high-impact social change initiatives. They're looking for leaders who aren't just about making money, but about making a real difference. And I think you're the perfect fit. The catch? They want you to come in as a key partner. They'll back your projects, give you access to massive resources, and let you make the decisions." Mark felt the room close in around him. This was what he had been avoiding for months. The offer of influence, of power, of resources that could elevate his work to new heights. It was tempting, more tempting than anything he had ever considered. And yet, something inside him hesitated. "What's the catch?" Mark asked, already sensing the strings attached. Daniel's voice grew quieter. "There's always a catch. They want control. They want to shape how you do things. They want someone who can navigate both worlds, philanthropy and profit. They won't force you to compromise, but they expect you to make things work within the system. No more idealism. No more fighting against the tide. You've got to be willing to play the game, Mark." Mark ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. On one hand, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Access to unlimited resources, a platform to make his work global. On the other hand, it was the system he had spent years trying to change. The same system that prioritized profit over people, power over equality. "You're talking about a partnership with the very people I've been trying to disrupt," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What happens when they decide they don't like the direction I'm taking? What happens when their interests and mine don't align?" Daniel's response was almost too quick. "That's the beauty of it. You're in control. You've got the power to influence how they operate, and you'll be backed by their resources. Trust me, you can make it work. You just have to be strategic." Mark leaned back in his chair, thinking. The idea of being able to affect real change on a larger scale, to have the resources and support to make his vision a reality, was undeniably attractive. But at what cost? It was a crossroads. Mark could continue to build his projects from the ground up, using the same slow, methodical approach that had worked so far, but with limited resources. Or he could step into a partnership that promised exponential growth and influence, but risk losing the very essence of what he had been fighting for. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing through the possibilities, each scenario playing out in his head, the pros and cons weighing on him like an invisible anchor. He needed clarity, and for that, he knew he had to turn to Nina. The next morning, he met her at their favorite cafe. She could tell something was off the moment she saw him. "You're considering the offer, aren't you?" she asked, her voice calm but knowing. Mark nodded. rubbing his temples. I don't know, Nina. This could change everything. I could have the resources to do so much more good, but I'm scared. What if I lose sight of everything I believe in? What if I become just another person who helps perpetuate the system I've been trying to dismantle? Nina took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. Mark, I've always known you as someone who operates with integrity. You've proven time and time again that you care about people. But the world doesn't always work on your terms. You've been fighting against the system, but maybe it's time to fight from within. The question isn't whether you take this deal, it's how you use it. Mark looked at her, his mind still cloudy with doubt. You think I can do both? Work within the system, but still stay true to my principles. I do, Nina said firmly. You've been changing lives already, but now you have a chance to change entire industries. You can take that money, those resources, and use them for good. You don't have to give up who you are. You just have to make sure you don't get lost in the process. Her words struck a chord with him. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to reject this opportunity outright. Maybe it wasn't about playing the game. It was about changing the rules. And this partnership could give him the platform to do just that. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision still pressing on him. He knew what he had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. He picked up his phone and called Daniel. I'm in, Mark said, his voice steady, but I want to make one thing clear. I won't compromise my values. If I'm going to partner with you, I'm doing it on my terms. Daniel's response was quick and full of enthusiasm. You won't regret this, Mark. I promise. As Mark hung up the phone, he felt both relieved and uncertain. The next chapter of his journey had begun, and it was one that would test every ounce of his integrity and conviction. But he was ready for the challenge. He was no longer just fighting against the system. He was going to change it from the inside. The road ahead was still filled with unknowns, but Mark knew one thing. The power to create change was now in his hands, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The real work was just beginning. Mark's decision to join the venture fund was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with opportunities but also fraught with challenges. The partnership promised resources, influence, and the ability to accelerate his projects, but it came at a cost. The price wasn't monetary. It was the constant push and pull between his ideals and the reality of the corporate world he had just entered. The first few months were a whirlwind. He attended meetings with high-powered investors, learned the ins and outs of corporate philanthropy, and worked on designing initiatives that would scale to meet the needs of entire communities. Mark had access to more resources than he'd ever imagined, and the possibilities seemed endless. But with each new meeting, each new decision, the tension within him grew. As he navigated this new world, Mark began to feel like he was constantly walking a tightrope. He had to toe the line between his ethical commitments and the demands of the venture fund, who were all about results, profits, and efficiency. He was starting to realize just how much influence the fund had, and how their business goals were often at odds with the social goals he had always championed. One day, Mark received a call from Carla, a colleague he had worked with in his earlier community initiatives. She had always been a voice of reason, someone who understood the heart of his mission. Mark, I need to talk to you about something. Carla's voice was urgent but careful. I've been hearing whispers about some of the decisions you've been making. It doesn't sit right with me, and I'm worried. Mark's stomach churned. What do you mean? It's the partners you're working with. They're pushing for rapid expansion, faster than you're comfortable with. And I've heard some of them talk about cutting corners, reducing funding for community-led projects to make things more profitable. This is what happens when you get in bed with people who care more about numbers than real change, Mark. Mark felt the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known that this moment might come, the moment when the reality of corporate interests would conflict with the mission he was fighting for. But hearing it from Carla, someone he trusted, made it all the more real. Carla, I've been trying to make it work. I've been pushing for community involvement, for transparency, but, his voice faltered, I don't know if I'm doing enough. You can't keep letting them pull you in different directions. You're losing sight of why you started this in the first place, Carla said, her voice gentle but firm. I'm not saying it's too late, but you need to make a choice. You either stand by your values, or you let them shape you into something you're not. Mark stood silently, the weight of her words settling over him. He had always prided himself on his integrity, but the compromises were becoming harder to ignore. With every new contract, every new partnership, he was inching further from the very ideals he had set out to uphold. That evening, as he walked into his office, Mark found himself staring at the sleek, modern space around him, the symbols of his success. The luxury, the power, the resources. Everything he had worked so hard for was right here. But in that moment, none of it felt like it was worth the price he was paying. His thoughts were interrupted by a meeting request from Daniel. They'd been working closely together on a new initiative, one that promised to take the social good platform global. Mark had been enthusiastic about it at first, but now he wasn't sure. The meeting was set in a sleek boardroom. Daniel sat across from him, his usual confident demeanor in full force. But there was something different about him today, an urgency in his eyes that Mark hadn't seen before. "Mark, I need you to make a decision," Daniel said, leaning forward. "The board is pushing for a new direction. They want to scale things faster, to prioritize international markets. That means cutting some local partnerships to free up resources. We're talking about hundreds of millions in investment, but it means we have to move quickly. You've got to be on board with this." Mark's heart sank. He had been anticipating a moment like this, when the interests of the venture fund would clash with the long-term, sustainable approach he had always advocated for. But hearing it from Daniel, someone who had been his ally, made it feel more real than ever. Cutting local partnerships? Mark echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. What happens to the communities we've been working with? What happens to the people we've promised to help? Daniel's face softened, but there was a hint of frustration in his tone. "I get it, Mark. I do. But we can't keep doing things the way you want. This is the reality of scaling. You have to make sacrifices. You can't change the world by staying small forever." Mark's chest tightened. Every fiber of his being screamed against what Daniel was suggesting. But he knew that refusing the plan meant jeopardizing everything they had worked for. The resources, the momentum, they were all riding on this decision. "This is wrong," Mark said, his voice shaking. "I've spent my entire career fighting for the people who have been left behind. And now, you're asking me to abandon them for profit? That's not why I started this. That's not what I believe in." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "I thought you were smarter than this, Mark. You've been in this game long enough to know that nothing gets done without compromise. You can't change things by being stubborn. You have to adapt." Mark felt a surge of anger and frustration, but also a profound sense of loss. He had wanted to believe that he could have both power and principles, but now it felt like one had to give way to the other. That night, Mark sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The journey he had started with so much hope and vision was now spiraling into something he didn't recognize. He was on the verge of losing everything he had fought for: the people, the mission, the core of who he was. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. It was Nina. He answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore." "I know," Nina said softly, "but you do know, Mark. You always have." In that moment, Mark knew he couldn't let this go on any longer. Something had to change. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But he needed to make one last decision. Would he compromise everything he believed in for success, or would he fight to maintain his integrity, no matter the cost? Mark spent days in turmoil, his thoughts swirling with confusion, anger, and self-doubt. The choice before him felt impossible. Sacrifice his principles to climb higher and make a bigger impact, or stand firm and risk losing everything he had worked for. He had come so far, yet it felt like the further he went, the more he was losing himself. It was no longer just about the people he wanted to help. It was about who he was becoming in the process. One night, Mark stood on the balcony of his high-rise apartment, staring out over the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, each one representing someone's dream, their struggle, their journey. He felt small in the face of it all, a man lost between two worlds, unsure of where to go. He remembered the day he first started working for the greater good. The days when he dreamed of using his skills to change lives, to level the playing field. The excitement, the energy, the belief that anything was possible. It had all felt so simple then. But now, the complexity of the choices he faced seemed insurmountable. Then, a thought struck him. It was something Nina had said just days before. You don't have to change everything overnight, but you can change the way you approach it. You don't have to become what you're fighting against. You just have to find a way to make your values fit within the system. Mark realized, with startling clarity, that he didn't have to abandon his principles to be part of the system. He could still fight for what he believed in. He just needed to do it smarter, more strategically. He could play the game on his terms, without compromising the very values that had driven him from the beginning. The next morning, Mark called a meeting with Daniel. He had made his decision. He wouldn't walk away from the opportunity, but he would reshape it to fit his vision. He was done being swept along by the tide. It was time to take control, to demand the change he had always dreamed of. When they sat down in the boardroom, Mark didn't waste any time. "I've thought a lot about where we go from here," he began, his voice steady. "And I've decided that I'm not willing to compromise my values to scale up. If we're going to move forward, it has to be on terms that make a real, lasting difference. No more cutting corners. No more sacrificing community interests for profit. If we're going to partner with corporations, they need to meet us halfway. I'll walk away from this venture if it's not a true partnership for social change." Daniel looked taken aback, but Mark could see the wheels turning in his head. He knew Daniel was a businessman first, but he also knew that Mark had become a force to be reckoned with. This wasn't the same idealistic Mark who had walked into the partnership months ago. This was a man who understood the system, who had learned how to use it to his advantage. "You're asking for a lot," Daniel said cautiously, his tone shifting. "But maybe you're right. Maybe we can do better. If you can convince the board, we'll give it a shot." Mark nodded. "I won't convince them with empty promises. I'll convince them by showing them that this is the future. Businesses that integrate real social responsibility into their operations will lead the way. The rest will fall behind." It wasn't easy. Over the next few weeks, Mark worked tirelessly to present a new vision for the partnership, one where corporate interests and social good could coexist without undermining each other. It meant tougher negotiations, more time spent in meetings, and more pressure than he had ever experienced. But with every step, Mark felt a sense of agency that he hadn't felt before. He was no longer fighting against the tide. He was steering the ship. Finally, after much deliberation, the board came to a decision. They would give Mark the autonomy he needed to restructure the way they approached their investments. They would prioritize community-driven initiatives and hold themselves accountable for the long-term impact of their work, not just short-term profits. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a victory. Mark had successfully redefined the partnership, keeping his values intact while positioning himself and the venture fund to create real, meaningful change. As he sat in his office that afternoon, reflecting on everything that had happened, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't lost himself in the process. He had stood his ground, fought for what was right, and managed to create a new path forward. The work wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, moments when the system would try to pull him in another direction, when his principles would be tested again. But Mark now knew that he didn't have to choose between doing good and doing business. He could do both, and do them well. The road ahead was long, but Mark was ready. He had discovered something important on this journey. That power wasn't about wealth or influence. It was about having the courage to stay true to your values, even when the world around you pushed you to abandon them. And with that realization, Mark knew that his real work was just beginning. Mark's success in redefining his partnership with the venture fund had given him a renewed sense of purpose, but it also attracted more attention, both good and bad. As the initiatives he spearheaded began to gain traction, Mark found himself facing mounting pressure from all sides. Some were impressed with his ability to balance social good with business, while others saw him as a threat to the status quo. One afternoon, as he was preparing for an important meeting with potential new investors, Mark received a message from Nina. It was brief but urgent. "We need to talk. Call me as soon as you get this." He immediately called her. Nina picked up on the second ring, her voice sounding strained. "Mark, I don't know how to say this, but there's something you need to know. I've been hearing rumors about the people you're working with, about the way your project is being handled. I'm not sure if it's just office gossip or something more serious, but it doesn't sit right with me. Mark's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What kind of rumors? Nina hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. I've heard that some of your new investors are pressuring you to prioritize profits over the community programs you've been so passionate about. They're saying that if you don't start scaling faster, they'll pull their support. They want numbers, Mark. They don't care about the people. They care about the bottom line. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. He had always known that the world of venture capitalism came with its own set of rules, but this was a stark reminder of how quickly things could change. The same investors who had promised to support his vision were now threatening to pull out unless he shifted his priorities. Are you sure about this? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I've been working closely with them. I've had a direct hand in shaping our strategy. Are you telling me they're trying to go back on their word? I'm afraid so, Nina replied. I've also heard that some of the board members are starting to question your approach. They're asking if you're really in control of the direction, or if you're just a figurehead doing the bidding of people who care more about money than about the social impact. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. For months, he had fought to prove that he could bring about change within the system, that he could balance profit and social good. But now it seemed like the very system he had worked so hard to navigate was pushing him to make a choice he didn't want to face. I can't believe this is happening, Mark said, his voice thick with frustration. I've been doing everything I can to stay true to my values. If I give in now, it'll all fall apart. Nina's voice softened, but there was an edge to it. Mark, this is a test. It's always been a test. The question is, how far are you willing to go to make your vision a reality? You can't keep riding the fence forever. You have to decide where you stand. Mark sat in silence, his mind racing. He had never been one to shy away from hard choices, but this felt like the hardest one yet. If he refused to compromise, he risked losing everything. The projects, the funding, the support of the people he had worked so hard to bring together. But if he gave in, he would lose himself. He would become the very thing he had fought against. He looked out of the window, trying to gather his thoughts. The city stretched out before him, a vast landscape of opportunity and challenge. He had always believed that true success came from staying true to your principles, but now, the pressure to conform was stronger than ever. That evening, Mark met with Daniel to discuss the concerns Nina had raised. He knew this would be a pivotal conversation, one that could determine the future of his work. Daniel, I need to talk to you about something important, Mark began, his voice steady but filled with underlying tension. I've heard some disturbing rumors about our investors, about the pressure they're putting on me to prioritize profits. I need to know where you stand. Are you on board with this approach, or is there something more going on here? Daniel looked taken aback, his face unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about, Mark, he said, his tone defensive. The investors want results, and they want them quickly. That's just how the game works. If you want to keep moving forward, you have to deliver. You can't just keep talking about community programs if they're not bringing in the returns we need. Mark's heart pounded. You're telling me that you're willing to compromise everything I've worked for just to hit numbers? Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. You've got to understand, Mark. This isn't just about you. It's about the long-term sustainability of everything we're trying to build. If we don't show results, none of it will matter. And if you're going to keep fighting for these small, localized initiatives without scaling them up, you'll be out of a job faster than you can blink. The words cut through Mark like a knife. He had known that compromise would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so cold, so final. Is that what this is about? Just results? Just numbers? Mark's voice was raw with emotion. I'm not here to play this game for profit. I'm here to make a real impact. If you can't see that, maybe we're not on the same page anymore. Daniel didn't respond immediately. The silence between them was thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he stood up, his face hardening. Think about what you're saying, Mark, Daniel said. You're not going to get far with that attitude. You can't change the world without playing the game. So either you start playing, or you walk away. But don't expect anyone to support you if you choose the latter. Mark's mind was spinning. The walls were closing in, and he knew he was at a crossroads. The pressure to conform was overwhelming, but deep down, He knew that compromising on his values would be the end of everything he had worked so hard to build. As he left the meeting, Mark's phone buzzed again. It was Nina, her name flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mark," Nina said, her voice low, "the board is meeting tomorrow. They're going to make a decision about the future of the project. I don't know what's going to happen, but I want you to know, no matter what you decide, I'm with you." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. It wasn't just the money, the power, or the opportunity that mattered. It was the people, the ones who believed in him and the mission. And whatever happened next, he couldn't lose sight of that. The decision loomed over him, and Mark knew it would shape the rest of his life. Would he stand firm and risk losing everything, or would he give in and compromise his integrity? The tension in the air was palpable, and it seemed like the breaking point was fast approaching. The night before the crucial board meeting, Mark couldn't sleep. His mind raced, every thought a tangled mess of doubt, fear, and frustration. The decision before him felt like the heaviest burden he had ever carried. Everything he had worked for, the social good projects, the partnerships, the alliances, was now on the line. But more importantly, his integrity was at stake. Would he sell out for success, or would he risk it all to stay true to his mission? He stood by his window, looking out over the sprawling city below, the lights flickering like distant stars. Each tiny flicker represented a person, a dream, a story. Mark thought about all the people he had promised to help, the communities who trusted him, the families who depended on his work. They were counting on him to make the right choice. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nina. "Don't forget why you started this. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already changed lives. Stay strong." Her words hit him hard. Nina had always been a steady anchor for him, a voice of reason. But now, more than ever, he needed to make his own decision. His path had always been guided by one simple principle: to create real change, even if it meant walking through fire to do it. The next morning, Mark entered the boardroom, his stomach a tight knot. He knew that the meeting would decide the future of everything he had fought for. On one side of the table sat the investors, powerful, calculating individuals who cared only about the bottom line. On the other side sat his team, loyal, passionate people who had been with him since the beginning, who believed in the vision of change. "Mark, it's good to see you here," Daniel said, his voice calm but with a hint of steel. He was the first to speak, looking at Mark as if gauging his next move. Mark took a deep breath. "Thanks, Daniel. Let's get to it." The investors had already made their position clear. They wanted results, and they wanted them fast. They had invested millions, and they weren't interested in waiting for the slow, methodical approach that Mark had championed. They demanded scale, rapid growth, and the kind of growth that would yield immediate returns. Local, community-driven projects? They were nice, but they weren't profitable enough to keep the business afloat. "I understand your concerns," Mark began, looking each investor in the eye. "But let me be clear about something. I didn't sign up for this to make a quick buck. I signed up to change the system, to prove that we can build a business that's both profitable and socially responsible. If we focus only on short-term growth, we'll end up sacrificing the very communities we're trying to help." There was a murmur around the table. Daniel shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Mark continued. "You want numbers. I get that. But if we push these programs into growth mode without solidifying their foundation, we'll burn out. We won't build trust. We'll be another business that took the money and ran, leaving people behind. I'm not willing to do that." The tension in the room was palpable. The investors exchanged glances, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air. Daniel leaned forward. "Mark, we're all here to create something big. You've made your case, but the truth is, we can't keep going at the pace you're suggesting. It's not sustainable. It's not realistic. The board is prepared to pull funding if we don't move faster." Mark's heart pounded. He knew this was the moment of truth. The ultimatum had been given. The board wanted rapid expansion and compromise, or they would walk away. "Then you'll have to walk away," Mark said, his voice resolute. "Because if I'm going to do this, I'm doing it on my terms. We can grow, we can scale, but we're going to do it in a way that creates lasting change. We won't just be another company chasing profits. We'll be a company that changes the world by helping the people who need it most." There was a long pause as the investors stared at him, shocked by his bold stance. Mark could see the gears turning in their heads, weighing the risk. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everything he believed in. The room fell silent as they absorbed the weight of his words. Finally, one of the investors, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, spoke up. "You really believe that, don't you?" she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a note of something else in it. Respect? Mark wasn't sure. "I do," he replied. "And I'm not asking anyone to follow me if they don't believe it too. But if you're here to make a difference, then you'll have to trust that we can make it happen. Together." The tension didn't disappear, but something shifted in the room. The investors exchanged a few more glances before the woman nodded slowly. "Okay, Mark, you've got our attention. Let's see if you can back it up." The meeting continued, but the direction had changed. Instead of demanding that Mark compromise, the investors began to discuss ways they could structure their investments to allow for slower, more sustainable growth. There were concessions, yes, but it was clear that they were willing to meet him halfway. By the end of the meeting, Mark felt exhausted but hopeful. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a victory. He had stood his ground. He hadn't given up his principles. He had shown them that true growth didn't mean sacrificing values for speed. It meant investing in people, in trust, and in long-term change. As Mark left the boardroom, his phone buzzed again. It was Nina. He smiled as he read her message. "You did it. Proud of you." It wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more tests ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was on the right path. He had made his choice, and it had been the hardest thing he had ever done. But it had been the right thing. As Mark stood in the elevator, heading back to his office, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had taken control of his destiny, and with that, he had found the power to truly change the world. Weeks had passed since the boardroom showdown, and the decision to stand firm in his values had begun to take shape. Mark could feel the weight of the choices he had made. Each step forward was met with a new wave of resistance, but also a new wave of possibility. Things had settled, but it was clear that the true test was yet to come. Mark sat at his desk, looking over the progress reports for the latest community initiatives. The numbers were promising, far better than he had expected. Still, the pressure of keeping the momentum going loomed large. The investors were on board, but only just. They had agreed to the compromise, but Mark knew that the real challenge was still ahead. Success was no longer measured just by financial returns. It was about proving that a business could be both profitable and ethical in the long run. As he flipped through the reports, a message flashed across his screen. It was from Nina. "We need to talk. Something's happened." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Nina was rarely this urgent. He immediately called her. "Nina, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I just got off the phone with the community leaders we've been working with in LA, Nina said, her voice tight. "There's been a major pushback. Some of the people we've been helping feel like they're being used as a front for the business. They're accusing us of exploiting their needs to make the company look good." Mark froze. "What do you mean exploiting?" "We've been transparent about everything we're doing. We've been upfront with them every step of the way." "I know," Nina said, her voice strained. "But some of the leaders are saying that the initiatives we're pushing aren't truly benefiting the community. They're just a way for the company to gain a positive image. They feel like we're taking advantage of their struggles without truly addressing the root problems. They want more tangible, long-term investments. They're threatening to cut ties if we don't step up and prove our commitment." Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of Nina's words sinking in. The last few months had been a whirlwind of negotiations, strategy, and compromise. He had thought that the initiative would speak for itself. But now, it was clear that the gap between his intentions and the reality on the ground was wider than he had realized. "How did this happen?" Mark asked, his mind spinning. "Why didn't anyone tell me about these concerns sooner?" Nina sighed. "I think part of it is that they felt like their voices weren't being heard. We've been so focused on scaling up, getting results, and keeping the investors happy that we forgot to engage with the community on a deeper level. The truth is, they're not just looking for handouts. They want real, long-term opportunities. And they're not convinced we're offering that. Mark closed his eyes, trying to process the information. He had always known that the work he was doing wasn't perfect, that there would be bumps along the way. But he hadn't anticipated this kind of backlash, especially from the very people he was trying to help. "You're right," Mark said quietly. "We've been too focused on the wrong things. I thought we were doing enough, but clearly, we're missing something. I need to fix this. I need to talk to them, and I need to show them that we're committed to real change, not just surface-level gestures." "Are you sure you can turn this around?" Nina asked, her voice uncertain. "It's a tough situation, Mark. They're angry. They feel betrayed." Mark leaned forward, determination burning in his chest. "I've been fighting for this from the beginning, Nina. If I can't fix this, if I can't prove that we're genuinely invested in their futures, then I don't deserve to be in this position. I'm going to make it right." The next few days were a blur. Mark traveled to Los Angeles to meet with the community leaders face-to-face. When he arrived, he was greeted by a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what he was about to do. The damage had already been done, but he had to make things right. He spent hours listening to the concerns of the community leaders. They talked about the broken promises, the empty gestures, and the lack of follow-through on the programs they had agreed to. Mark felt the weight of every word. They weren't wrong. They had every right to feel betrayed, and he had to own that. After the meeting, Mark called Nina. "We have work to do," he said. "This isn't just about making a few changes. It's about completely restructuring our approach to these initiatives. We need to involve the community in every step of the process, and we need to make long-term investments that truly benefit them. I'm not leaving here until we've made a real commitment." The emotional weight of the situation was overwhelming, but Mark felt something else too, a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a setback. It was an opportunity to prove that he wasn't just another businessman looking to make a quick profit. He was in this for the long haul, and he was willing to do whatever it took to show that his commitment was real. Over the next few months, Mark worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community. He held town hall meetings, created partnerships with local organizations, and restructured the funding to focus on long-term education, job training, and sustainable growth. The process was slow, painful, and filled with setbacks, but it was the only way forward. Through it all, Mark remained focused on one thing, proving that change could happen even when it seemed impossible. And slowly, the community began to see the difference. They began to trust him again. One afternoon, as Mark was wrapping up a meeting with some of the community leaders, one of them pulled him aside. It was the same woman who had been most vocal in her criticism earlier. "Mark," she said, her voice softer now, "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't think this would work. I didn't think you'd come through. But you've shown us that you're serious. You've kept your promises. You've listened to us." Mark smiled, the weight of the journey finally lifting. "I'm just getting started." And for the first time in a long while, Mark truly believed it. Mark had faced his greatest test and come out the other side stronger, more resolved than ever. The emotional roller coaster of the past few months had transformed him, not just as a businessman, but as a person. He had learned that real success wasn't about accolades or numbers. It was about the relationships you built, the trust you earned, and the legacy you left behind. He wasn't just creating a company anymore. He was creating a movement that proved that change was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The months that followed were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and deep reflection. Mark's renewed commitment to his mission was beginning to bear fruit, but it wasn't easy. While the community leaders had begun to trust him again, the investors were growing impatient. They had agreed to the changes, but they were increasingly concerned about the slow pace of progress. The pressure was mounting from all sides. On one hand, the communities that needed real change, and on the other, the investors who demanded fast, measurable results. One crisp morning, as Mark prepared for another round of talks with the investors, he received a call from Daniel. His old friend's voice sounded tense. "Mark, we need to talk," Daniel said, his tone unusually serious. "The board is starting to ask tough questions again. They're not happy with the pace. They're questioning whether you can deliver on your promises." Mark's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from Daniel made it feel all the more real. "I understand, Daniel," Mark replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety creeping in. "But I've made my decision. I'm not going to sacrifice the integrity of the project just for the sake of speed. The long-term impact is what matters." "I get that," Daniel said, his voice softening, "but you need to be prepared. The board is talking about a potential leadership change. If they don't see results soon, they might decide to bring in someone who can scale faster." Mark paused, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about proving his vision anymore. It was about holding on to everything he had worked for. "I won't let them take this from me," Mark said quietly. "I've already made my choice." "Just be careful," Daniel warned. "You've got a lot riding on this." The conversation ended, and Mark stood in silence, the reality of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. The board was serious about pushing him out if things didn't improve quickly. But Mark wouldn't compromise. He had worked too hard, and he had come too far to let the project evolve into just another money-making machine. He walked into the meeting with the investors later that afternoon, his mind clear but his nerves on edge. The faces around the table were familiar, but today they were more critical than ever. "Mark," the lead investor began, her voice sharp, "we've been patient, but it's time for results. The community programs are a noble cause, but we need to see returns. We've made our expectations clear from the start, and frankly, the progress is not where it needs to be." Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. He'd prepared for this moment, and now it was time to face it. "I understand your concerns," Mark said, his voice firm, "but I also want you to understand where I'm coming from. These initiatives aren't just projects to me. They're a blueprint for how we can truly change the system. The results you're asking for can't happen overnight. But I promise you, if you give me the time and the resources to build this right, the returns will come. Not just in numbers, but in lasting impact." The room was silent for a moment. Mark could feel the weight of their skepticism. They had heard the promises before, but they hadn't seen the results they were hoping for. Mark knew that now, more than ever, he had to convince them. Not just with words, but with action. "I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith," he continued. "I'm asking you to trust that what we're building is worth the investment. We've seen progress. We've seen lives change. But this isn't a short-term game. It's a long-term commitment. If you're willing to stay the course, we'll succeed together. But if you're looking for an immediate return, then I'm afraid this isn't the project for you." There was a long silence, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, the lead investor spoke again, her voice steady but thoughtful. "You're asking us to take a big risk, Mark," she said. "And that's a difficult ask in this climate. But we've been with you from the start, and we've seen your passion. So here's what we'll do. We'll give you one more quarter. If we don't see substantial progress, we'll have to reevaluate our involvement. But we're willing to give you this chance." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was just another hurdle, not the end of the road. The pressure was still on, and he had only a limited window of time to prove that his approach could succeed. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the relief he felt. "I won't let you down." As the meeting came to a close, Mark walked out of the room, his mind already racing with the next steps. He had secured a small victory, but the real work was only just beginning. The clock was ticking, and he needed to ensure that his vision would not only survive, but thrive. That night, as he sat in his office, looking out over the city, Mark thought back to the early days of the project. He remembered the late nights, the doubts, the moments when he almost gave up. But he had pushed through, and now, he was facing the biggest test of his life. Could he pull this off? Could he prove to the investors that real change was possible, even in the face of skepticism? He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up. He had a vision, and he was going to see it through, no matter what it took. The stakes had never been higher, but Mark was ready for the challenge. The path ahead was uncertain, but Mark had made his decision. He would fight for what he believed in, no matter the cost. And as the sun set over the horizon, he couldn't help but feel that his journey, his true journey, was only just beginning. The following weeks felt like a blur. Mark's resolve was unwavering, but the pressure was beginning to take its toll. The clock was ticking, and the pressure to deliver results was mounting. His phone buzzed constantly with updates, emails, and calls from both the investors and his team. The community programs were progressing, but at a pace slower than anyone had hoped for. The investors were growing more impatient, and Mark could feel their doubts creeping in. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mark found himself sitting in his office, staring at the mountain of reports on his desk. His thoughts were a tangled mess. He had poured everything into this project, his time, his energy, his soul, and yet it still felt like it wasn't enough. The fear of failure gnawed at him. Could he really pull this off? Could he make this vision a reality before time ran out? A knock at the door broke his reverie. It was Nina, her face drawn and tired from weeks of dealing with the fallout from the community's concerns and the pressure from the investors. She walked in, closing the door behind her, and took a seat across from Mark. "We need to talk," she said, her voice heavy with something that Mark couldn't quite place. "The investors are asking for a meeting tomorrow. They want to discuss final decisions. I think they're about to pull the plug if they don't see results, Mark. We're running out of time." Mark felt his heart sink. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been trying everything I can think of to show them we're on the right path, but it's just not moving fast enough." Nina leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Mark, they want to see numbers. They want tangible proof. They don't care about the communities we're helping or the long-term vision. All they see are numbers, and right now, those numbers don't add up." Mark ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his decisions. "I don't know what else I can do. I've been working day and night, trying to make this work. But if they pull out, everything I've fought for, everything we've built, could collapse." Nina looked at him, her expression softening. "But you've done everything right, Mark. You've stayed true to your mission. You've proven that you care. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean you've failed. You've changed lives already, even if they don't see it." Mark sighed, running his hands over his face. "I wish it were that simple. But if I don't show them results, if I don't deliver what they want, I'll lose everything. I can't just walk away from this now. I can't give up." Nina stood, walking over to the window. "Sometimes, Mark, it's not about holding on so tightly. It's about knowing when to let go. I've seen you struggle with this for months. You've fought so hard, but you can't change the way they think. You've already done more than anyone else ever would. I'm proud of you, no matter what happens." Mark's chest tightened at Nina's words. The tension between wanting to stay true to his mission and facing the harsh reality of the situation had never been more acute. The journey had taken everything from him: his relationships, his health, his sense of peace. But he had come so far. Was it all for nothing? "Nina, I don't know if I can walk away from this," Mark said, his voice trembling. "I've given everything. I can't just turn my back on it." She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to walk away. But you do need to ask yourself what you're willing to sacrifice. You've given so much already. Don't lose yourself in the process. Whatever happens, you've already made a difference." Mark's eyes burned with unshed tears. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, the burden of his choices almost unbearable. He had worked so hard to make this dream a reality, but at what cost? The next day, the meeting with the investors was as tense as Mark had imagined. He walked into the room, determined to give it everything he had left, but as the board members filed in, he could see the doubt in their eyes. They had given him their ultimatum: show progress, or they would pull their funding. "Mark," the lead investor began, her tone cold and direct, "we've given you a lot of time, but we're still not seeing the results we need. Your initiatives are admirable, but we've invested too much to wait indefinitely. If we don't see substantial returns by the end of this quarter, we'll have to cut our losses." Mark's mind raced. He knew that this was the moment of truth. If he didn't convince them now, he risked losing everything: the project, his mission, his chance to make a difference. He stood up, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. But I want you to understand something. The numbers are just part of the equation. What we're doing here isn't just about making money. It's about creating a legacy, about showing the world that you can do business differently. You can make a profit and still care about the people you serve. That's not something that happens overnight. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. We're not asking for miracles, the lead investor said. We're asking for results. And right now, the numbers don't add up. Mark's heart sank. He could feel the walls closing in. He had given everything he had, but it wasn't enough. And he knew, deep down, that the path he had chosen, trying to change the system, might just be impossible to follow. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the tension. It was Daniel, who had quietly entered the room and stood at the back. He had been silent throughout the meeting, but now he spoke up. "Mark's right," Daniel said, his voice firm. "You can't measure a movement by short-term results. Real change takes time. And if you want to pull out now, fine. But you won't find someone else who cares as much as he does about actually making a difference. He's not just in this for the money. He's in it for something bigger." The room fell silent. Mark looked at Daniel, grateful for the unexpected support, but the weight of the decision was still heavy. The investors would make their decision soon, but Mark couldn't help but wonder if he had already lost. As the meeting ended, Mark left the room with a sinking feeling in his chest. He had fought, but now the only question left was whether it had been enough. The next few days passed in a haze. Mark's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions, doubts, fears, all swirling in a chaotic storm. He had fought hard for the community, for his vision, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The meeting with the investors had been the tipping point. The ultimatum had been made clear. They either saw results soon, or they would withdraw. And now, Mark was at a crossroads. He spent most of his time at his desk, poring over reports and plans, trying to find a way to make things work. But the truth was, he couldn't fix everything on his own. Not in the short time the investors were asking for. His mind kept drifting back to Nina's words. "Sometimes, Mark, it's not about holding on so tightly. It's about knowing when to let go." He had been so determined to prove himself, to prove that his way of doing business was the right way. But now, the reality was that it might not work the way he had hoped. The weight of the decision was heavier than he could carry alone. One evening, as the sun set behind the skyscrapers outside his office window, Mark stood up and walked over to the window. He stared out at the city, feeling the pull of everything he had worked for, and the weight of everything that might slip away. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nina. "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot in 20 minutes. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew what this meant. Nina had been with him through every step of the journey, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what she had to say now. Despite everything, he made his way to their usual meeting spot, a small, quiet cafe they had frequented when they first started working together. It was a place that had once felt full of possibility. Tonight, it felt different. When he arrived, Nina was already there, sitting at a corner table, her face tired but resolute. Mark sat down across from her, his heart racing. "You're not going to like what I have to say," Nina began, her voice gentle but firm. Mark looked at her, his stomach churning. "Just say it." "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said, her eyes meeting his. "About the investors, about the community, about you. I've seen how hard you've worked, how much you've sacrificed. But I think you need to face the truth, Mark. Sometimes, the hardest thing is knowing when to walk away." Mark swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had already known this was coming. But hearing it from Nina, the person who had stood by him the longest, felt like a gut punch. "I've tried to make this work," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've put everything I have into this. I've fought for the community, I've fought for the investors, and I've fought for my own beliefs. I can't just walk away now. I've come too far." "I know," Nina replied softly. "But maybe the real victory isn't about holding on until the end. Maybe it's about recognizing when you've done enough. You've created something meaningful, Mark. You've changed lives. And if the investors don't see that, then maybe they're not the right partners for you." Mark sat in silence, his mind racing. Nina's words felt like a balm to the raw wound inside him. She was right. He had done everything he could. He had made a difference, even if it wasn't in the way the investors had imagined. Maybe it was time to let go. But the thought of losing everything he had worked for was still unbearable. "I don't know if I can let go," Mark whispered. "I've invested too much, my heart, my soul. I don't know who I am without this mission." Nina reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. "You're not your work, Mark. You're not defined by what you've built. You've done incredible things, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice everything for it. There's more to life than this one project." Mark looked at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But I promised them. I promised the people in the community that I would make a real change. I can't just walk away." "You've already made a change," Nina said, her voice steady. "Maybe it's time to let others carry it forward. You've built something solid, something that can continue, even if you're not the one leading it. And you can still be a part of it, just not in the way you thought." Mark took a deep breath, the weight of Nina's words settling in. Maybe she was right. Maybe the greatest gift he could give the community, and himself, was the freedom to step back and allow others to carry on the work. He had started this journey with the belief that he had to do everything himself, but maybe real leadership meant knowing when to pass the torch. As he sat there, looking at Nina, something inside him began to shift. He wasn't giving up. He was evolving. He was learning to let go, to trust that the change he had set in motion could continue without him being the sole driver. "I think you're right," Mark said quietly. "Maybe I've been holding on too tight." Nina smiled, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "It's not about letting go of the mission, Mark. It's about letting go of the need to control everything. You've already made a difference. Now it's time to give others the space to make their own." The conversation ended, but Mark knew that something had shifted in him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had done his best. He had fought for his vision, and he had changed lives along the way. But it was okay to step back. It was okay to trust that the work would continue, even if he wasn't the one leading it. The next day, Mark made the hardest decision of his career. He called the investors and told them that he was stepping down from the leadership role. He explained that while the project was important, it needed a new leader, someone who could move it forward at the pace they required. He wasn't abandoning the mission, but he was choosing to evolve and find new ways to make an impact. The investors, while disappointed, agreed to continue supporting the initiative under new leadership. Mark knew it was the right decision. He had no idea what the future would hold, but he was ready to find his next path, one where he could make a difference without losing himself in the process. As he left the building that day, Mark took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in months. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And now, it was time to look forward, toward a new beginning. Mark had learned that real success wasn't about holding on tightly to the dream. It was about letting go when the time was right and trusting that what you've built will continue to grow, with or without you at the helm. And as he walked into the future, he knew that the true legacy he had built was not in the numbers, but in the lives he had touched along the way. After stepping down from his role as the project leader, Mark found himself at a crossroads. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what came next. He had poured everything into the mission, the long hours, the sacrifices, the setbacks, and though he knew he had made the right decision by letting go, he couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The project he had built was no longer his to guide, and the weight of that change was profound. But as the days went by, Mark began to realize something. The world hadn't ended. The community programs were still running. The initiatives he had helped to shape continued to evolve, and the new leadership seemed to have a clear vision. He didn't have to be the one pulling every string for the work to be effective. The changes he had initiated had a life of their own now, and perhaps that was the ultimate success, creating something that could continue without him at the center. The decision to step away had given him the space to look inward, to reconnect with himself in a way he hadn't been able to during his obsession with the project. Mark spent time with his family and friends, finding joy in the simple moments that had once been overshadowed by his work. He rediscovered hobbies and passions he had neglected for years, things that brought him peace and reminded him that there was more to life than just business. But even as he found peace, Mark knew that his journey was far from over. He had always believed in the power of transformation, not just for businesses, but for individuals too. And now, it was time to focus on his own transformation. One afternoon, Mark received a call from an unexpected source, Daniel. It had been a while since they had spoken, but when Mark picked up, Daniel's voice was as familiar as ever. "Mark," Daniel said, "I've been thinking. Even after everything you've gone through with the project, I still believe in what you're doing. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. It's just the beginning of something else." Mark was quiet for a moment. The words resonated with him, but he wasn't sure what they meant for him yet. "Maybe," Mark said thoughtfully, "but what does that something else look like?" "Well, I've been working on a new venture," Daniel continued, "a smaller-scale initiative that focuses on social entrepreneurship and helping local businesses thrive in underserved communities. It's not as grand as what you were doing, but I think it's something you could really make a difference in. Your experience, your vision. It could help change the lives of so many small entrepreneurs who want to give back to their communities." Mark sat up, intrigued. He had always been passionate about empowering others, but the idea of working on a smaller scale, one that could directly impact local communities, sparked something within him. This wasn't the large-scale initiative he had once dreamed of, but it could be something just as meaningful in a more personal, hands-on way. "That sounds interesting," Mark said, his voice gaining energy. "What kind of support do you need?" Daniel's excitement was palpable. "I've already started putting together a team, but I'd really like you to come on board. We need someone who understands how to build relationships with communities, who understands what it takes to make meaningful change. It's not about making a quick buck. It's about creating opportunities that last." Mark thought for a moment, letting the idea settle in his mind. He had spent so much time focused on the bigger picture, the grand vision. Maybe this was the right opportunity to take the lessons he had learned and apply them in a more personal, impactful way. "I'm in," Mark said, his decision clear. "Let's do it." As the next few weeks passed, Mark dove into his new role with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The small-scale initiative was a far cry from the sprawling network he had once managed, but it felt right. Working directly with local entrepreneurs, helping them secure funding, and creating a sustainable business model that aligned with their values. It was everything he had ever wanted to do, but on a level that felt more connected and immediate. The project took shape quickly, and soon Mark found himself traveling from one small town to the next, meeting with entrepreneurs, sharing his knowledge, and helping them grow. It was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. The personal connections he was forming with the people he was helping, those who truly cared about their communities, reminded him of the initial spark he had felt when starting his first project. One afternoon, as he sat down with a group of local business owners in a small cafe, Mark realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. The pressure was lower than before, but the impact was just as profound. He didn't need to change the entire world on his own. He just needed to help others create the change they wanted to see. And in doing so, he had found his own peace. The initiative flourished over the next few months, and Mark began to see the fruits of his labor. Businesses thriving, jobs created, and communities coming together. It wasn't the scale he had once dreamed of, but it was a success in its own right. And for the first time in years, Mark was able to take a step back and truly appreciate the work he was doing. But the journey wasn't just about professional success. It was about personal growth too. Mark had learned to let go of his need for control, to trust that the work would continue even without him at the center. He had learned that the true value of his efforts wasn't just in the tangible outcomes, but in the people he had impacted along the way. In the end, Mark realized that his purpose wasn't tied to a specific project, a set of investors, or even a particular outcome. His purpose was in the people he helped, the relationships he built, and the knowledge he shared. And that, he knew, was a legacy that would endure far beyond any one project. As Mark stood at the front of a room full of eager entrepreneurs, sharing his story and his knowledge, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The journey had been hard, but it had shaped him into the person he was today. And as he looked at the faces in the room, faces filled with hope and determination, he knew that this was just the beginning of something even greater. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Mark was ready. Ready to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others. Ready to step into the next chapter of his life, knowing that the work he had started would continue, and that he was part of a movement much bigger than himself. As Mark continued his work with the new social entrepreneurship initiative, he found himself reflecting on everything he had learned over the past few years. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been invaluable. He had started with one mission: to change the world through business, and he had come far from where he had imagined. The path had taken unexpected twists and turns, but Mark had learned that sometimes the journey itself was more important than the destination. It wasn't just the projects, the numbers, or the accolades that mattered anymore. It was the relationships he had built, the lives he had touched, and the changes he had inspired in others. As he watched the entrepreneurs in the program grow and thrive, Mark realized that the true success wasn't in a large-scale revolution. It was in the ripple effects he had created. By empowering individuals and helping them realize their potential, he had started a movement of change that would continue far beyond his own involvement. One evening, Mark received a message from Daniel, who had been working closely with him on the initiative. They had made great strides over the past year, and the program had seen incredible success. Local businesses were thriving, communities were getting stronger, and there was a renewed sense of hope in the areas they worked in. "Mark, I think it's time we shared this success with the world," Daniel wrote. "We've made a real impact, and now we need to take it further. We need to inspire others to do the same, to show that change can start small but grow big. What do you think?" Mark sat back in his chair, reading the message again. The idea of expanding the initiative, of taking what they had built and sharing it on a larger scale, was both exciting and daunting. It meant more work, more responsibility, and more attention than they had ever received. But it also meant that their message would reach more people. And that, to Mark, was what this had always been about: spreading hope, inspiring others, and making a difference. After a long pause, Mark picked up his phone and typed a response: "Let's do it." They spent the next several months refining their approach, working on a way to share their story and inspiring others to replicate what they had done in their own communities. They launched a campaign that highlighted the success stories of the local entrepreneurs, showcasing the impact of their work and the lessons they had learned along the way. It wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the heart behind the initiative. As they launched the campaign, Mark found himself reflecting on everything he had been through. It felt like a full-circle moment. He had started his journey with grand ambitions, thinking that one person could change the world. But now, he saw things differently. True change wasn't about forcing things to happen. It was about nurturing and empowering others, creating a movement of change that could carry itself forward, even without him at the forefront. The response to the campaign was overwhelming. People from all over the world reached out, inspired by the stories of small businesses making a difference in their communities. Mark and Daniel received offers to speak at conferences, share their story in interviews, and guide others in creating similar initiatives in their own neighborhoods. But even with the growing attention and success, Mark never lost sight of what truly mattered: the people he was helping. He continued to visit the businesses he had helped launch, attending community events, and spending time with the entrepreneurs who had become more like family to him. One evening, at a small gathering of local business owners, Mark stood up to speak. He looked around at the familiar faces in the room, faces filled with pride, determination, and hope. These were the people who had believed in the vision from the start. They had weathered the storm with him, and together, they had built something meaningful. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished here," Mark said, his voice filled with emotion. "But the real credit goes to all of you. You've taken what we've started and turned it into something incredible. This is what success looks like. It's not the big numbers or the big headlines. It's the people, the communities, the connections we've made. And that's what will continue to grow long after we're gone." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place, not in the lofty goals of his past, but in the quiet, everyday impact he was making. This was his true legacy: the people he had empowered, the lives he had touched, and the change he had sparked. As Mark looked around the room, he realized that his journey had brought him exactly where he needed to be. He had learned to let go, to trust others, and to find meaning in the connections he had made. And as he moved forward, he knew that the work would continue, not because of him, but because of the people who had taken up the mantle and carried it forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mark had learned that the greatest success didn't lie in achieving a grand vision alone, but in building something that could last beyond him. As he walked out of the room that evening, surrounded by people he had helped, he knew that the future was bright, not because of the work he had done, but because of the work that others would continue to do in the years to come. The road had been long, but Mark had found his way. And now, it was time to see where this new chapter would lead. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Mark didn't need to know what came next. He just knew that the impact they had created would continue, ripple by ripple, forever changing lives.